please welcome data protection law expert and the director of the Brussels Privacy Hub, Christopher Kuhner, and the panel.
Well, thank you very much, Parminder, for that kind introduction to the final panel of this wonderful conference. Indeed, I'm Christopher Kuhner of the Brussels Privacy Hub. I'll be moderating this panel. I understand before we get started, Giovanni may want to say some words, or you do that later, Giovanni?
I will sleep on your concerns.
All right, okay. So we will begin this panel then. This panel is designed to be a bit different than a normal closing panel is of a conference, where you normally have a summation of everything that's gone in a conference. In this panel, we're going to try not just to sum up the conference, but really to look ahead and try to come up with some answers to some of the difficult and important questions that have been raised. Now, before we begin, I want to make one important announcement, which will allow you to give feedback and make your voice heard. We have a question which will be coming up, I think, on your app, and should also be very soon coming up on the screen, which we'd like to ask you to vote on. And this will be a yes or no vote, and you can do this via your app, and then by the end of the panel, we'll be able to announce the results of what the results of this poll was. The question is as follows: are you in favor of a treaty or agreement on digital ethics at the level of the UN or some other international organization? That's, I think, a fairly clear question that you can answer yes or no on. If you want to vote, please do so early on so that your vote can be tallied, and you have to do that by hashtag yes or hashtag no. So hashtag being that cross symbol with the word yes or no. And again, you can do that on your app. Again, the question, are you in favor of a treaty or agreement on digital ethics at the level of the UN or some other international organization? Now, on this occasion, we have a very stellar panel here. I'm not going to spend time introducing them, giving their full backgrounds, because they're also illustrious. This would take far too long. But we have, starting on my far right, Wojciech Wiewiorowski, who's the Assistant European Data Protection Supervisor. We have Pam Dixon of the World Privacy Forum. And then we have Elonai Hickok of the Center for Internet and Society, India. And then finally, Jules Polonetsky of the Future of Privacy Forum. We have a fairly limited time to deal with these important questions, 50 minutes. I'm going to give each speaker a certain amount of time, and we will be fairly strict in trying to ask them to stay to their allotted time so that we can have questions from the audience. Now, we're not, because of the size of this room, we're not going to have someone going around with a microphone, but you can pose questions, again, via the app, via the online app, and then we will get a list of them, and we will be able to pose some of them to the panelists. So, without further ado, I would ask, first of all, Wojciech to begin. Wojciech will have a special dispensation. Will have 10 minutes, rather than the others will have 5 minutes. And the reason for that is, this morning, there was the Creative Cafe of this conference, which I think is supposed to be a sort of think tank for the conference, drawing together a number of experts from all different sectors and different types of stakeholders to discuss questions about digital ethics, and in particular to discuss how to move forward to really implement digital ethics. So we're all very curious, Wojciech, to hear what the results are, and I'll turn the floor over to you now for 10 minutes and ask you to present them to us, please.
Thank you very much. Well, it was really very funny experience, because we've been preparing it for a year. Then we have an hour and a half to discuss among 53 persons. And finally, I have 10 minutes for presentation of what we discussed about. And of course, this is all because the idea of Creative Cafe is that this is the beginning of the longer process, something that we will be able to look at in probably 3-4 years to ask ourselves, did we just have a nice conference in Brussels in 2018, or that was the beginning of some process, that was the beginning of something that was developed in the later years. So I will be shining with reflected light. The things that you will see here on the screen in a while, and that I will actually read for you, these are not my thoughts. These are the collective thoughts of 53 persons made into 5 slides by 4 persons. So what were the pathways that we want to use in the next few years? I think I can go to the presentation or not. I can't see on the big screen.
It's behind you.
It's, okay, and can I see it here as well? That would make it much easier for me. Okay, I will try to read from this then. Okay, so we have the first let's say, idea that came out of that is that there are the new methodologies which are needed to build ethics into the fabric of organization and technology. We need to empower employees who use their ethical agency. This is not just about the rules. This is rather the new way of thinking that ensures ethics are including in the behavior, in the design, and in the practice. And we should turn the spotlight on ourselves and ask ourselves the questions, what is if I'm the object of the processing, and what if these are my beloved ones who are? But actually, the slide that you see right now is the last slide that should be presented, because there was something which led us to this fact. We started with the question that we want to imagine how digital ethics can be applied in the normal activity in these few years. What are the pathways to take to make it operational? And we said that implementing of digital ethics is the process that is going to take time. This is process of repeating, asking ourselves the questions, but we should not give up. The new rights have to be developed, including the right to be offline and the luxury to be disconnected. Greater self-determination should be supported at the same time by institutions, infrastructures, and new business models, although there was a question which appeared, are these institutions and business model ethical themselves? Are the auditors of this process ethical? Companies need to be incentivized to adopt culture of ethics. And as I said, the new technologies are needed to be built in ethical style. But as I said, this is just the beginning of what we want to discuss in the next few years. To show you how difficult it is, I would like to ask my good friend, Bojana Bellamy, to show us what are the comments to that and what are comments to the methodology, just to show you how vital the discussion will be. Bojana.
Thank you, Wojciech, and everybody. This morning we were at the Creative Cafe. I can tell you we were creative, but we didn't get any coffee because our subsidies to the European institutions do not extend to that view. Thank you, Wojciech, for organizing and getting us very early up to think creatively. I would like to offer 2 perspectives. What have I learned from this process? Number 1, when we are making these big decisions and being bold and thinking ahead, we need to take into account plurality of views. We have to think, how does the other point of view look like? And why are these people saying what they're saying? And this is going to be incredibly important if we are going to get where we need to be. For those of us who are privacy practitioners, we have to consider what does that look for us every day in our lives, every day in our work. How do I take into account that opposing, different, challenging or complementary view? For you privacy regulators, the same applies as well. How are you going to take into account the views of those who are supposed to be building and delivering these digital ethics every day when they get to work? So that's my first point. My second point is that we have to make sure that this virtual table, our Creative Cafe, continues. It continues when we go back to our work, to our countries, and I hope that this conference and its permanency may provide for the fora, but I'm looking to EDPS to create that fora as well. Final point. We have to bring people on this journey with us, and people who are not in this room. And in order to lead, you have to inspire people, you have to explain to them why this matters. So I'm asking all of you to think about other people, other organizations, public sector, governments, experts who we need to bring on this journey as well. So Wojciech, again, thank you so much for your leadership and getting us together.
That was 1 year of preparation, 1.5 hours of discussion, 10 minutes of presentation. Now we had 53 persons in the room who were discussing. We have 1,000 people here in the room, and we want to have several million people to discuss about it for this 7 billion which we have in the world in the next few years. So let's look at 2022 if we achieved something out of the results of this conference. Thank you.
Well, I have to say, I'm extremely impressed that 1 year of work and all of the session this morning and 53 people, and you really compressed, both you, Wojciech, and Bojana, very well into just a few minutes, the gist of many of the important steps that need to be taken. And I think the points Bojana made are good, in particular that this needs to be an ongoing initiative. We need to bring others in, etc. So let's continue moving on, and I want to turn now to Pam Dixon. Pam, I have a question for you. We know that in many areas of ethics, there has been much achieved through the use of non-binding codes and different instruments. And I'm wondering, do we also need to move towards a digital Hippocratic Oath or a digital Nuremberg Code also with regard to digital ethics?
Thank you so much for your question, and I want to thank the organizers and Giovanni Buttarelli for your kind invitation to talk about this vital topic. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed the conference very much so far. I've listened now to a day and a bit more of discussion about ethics, and I want to focus on just two things, and I'll sneak in a third if I have some time. So first, I want to go back to the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code is an extraordinarily important set of ethics. The Nuremberg Code, as I think almost everyone here will know, was developed not out of theory, but out of absolute reaction to something extraordinarily important. After World War II, there was a set of war trials in Nuremberg, Germany. During these trials, it became clear that there had been human experimentation on people who were being held prisoner. And the collective response of the judges, all of now free Germany, and the world was never, ever again. And as a result, the Nuremberg Code was written. The number one principle of the Nuremberg Code is that you cannot have human research, you cannot have human medical research without meaningful consent. That ethic is in the context of what happened. The ethical code, the principles of the Nuremberg Code grew from reality. The code wasn't written and then applied to reality. The reality existed, and it was horrifying. And then the code existed. In the same way, to develop a Nuremberg Code for today's digital ecosystem and the needs we have in this ecosystem to prevent harm. I see the judge here. Thank you so much for your talk yesterday. It was very meaningful. In 2010, I went to India, and I lived there for a year. From 2010 to 2016, I conducted extensive research in the field on the Aadhaar digital biometric ID. I observed a situation where in 2010, I was raising my hand to every government official and saying, you know what, I think we have a problem here. We need some laws around how digital ID and biometrics are going to be used in the context of India. And everyone said, oh, this is voluntary. And I said to everyone, this will become mandatory, and what then? What then? Well, by 2016, there were a billion, with a B, a billion people who were enrolled in Aadhaar, because guess what? The Aadhaar biometric ID became mandatory. You could not be born, you could not die, you could not get married, you could not get a pension, you could not get a scholarship, you could not open a bank account, and you could not get even proper employment without an Aadhaar biometric ID. This is the Supreme Court ruling, which the judge spoke of. So the report that we wrote on this ID, the title of the report was India's Aadhaar, a failure to do no harm. The new Nuremberg Code must arise from reality. The reality in India, the Supreme Court ruling, I believe, has taken care of in a very fair way. I'll give you some very specific examples of the things I was afraid of with expansive, very accurate biometric use tied to a digital ID for a billion people in India. One was that I was very concerned that victims of human trafficking would be denied health care. This happened. Two, I was denied that there would be ethnic cleansing based on Aadhaar. This happened. I was very concerned about bias and discrimination against people living in extreme poverty. This happened. I was concerned about discrimination based on caste. This happened. This can happen with highly accurate, for example, facial recognition and whatnot. So what does that mean for today? To acquire a practical path forward with a new Nuremberg Code, we must look at the reality. So to apply it more broadly, today in governments, institutions, and companies, we will now have a very highly accurate biometric system. The accuracy, for example, of facial recognition is now at 99.8%, according to the latest test just announced this week. We have companies which have highly accurate facial recognition, such as Microsoft. How will these technologies be deployed in the government? How will these technologies be deployed with law enforcement purposes? Will they be used to discriminate? What are we afraid of? Can we articulate what it is that we are afraid of? Can we articulate the bad things that can happen? When we can do this, we can then go from the reality and say, look, here is what we're concerned about. Here are the bad things that can happen. And here are the practical ways we can mitigate it in this context. So biometrics and facial recognition is one area where we must ensure that the technology provides a public good and does no harm. We have to make it real and practical, and that is the new Nuremberg Code and how we get there. We must empower all stakeholders. Governments must empower all stakeholders. Institutions must empower all stakeholders. Companies must empower all stakeholders, including users. And we must find a way to discuss these things very practically with empowerment so that we create mutual trust. Without that, we have tragedies and disasters. I like what's happened in India. I think it was a very good solution. And now we wait for legislation which responds to the crisis, including even people dying because they did not have authentication with their biometric. So there are real harms to be addressed in India. So we now know that there are case studies in a variety of areas of privacy and human rights. We must address these in smaller ecosystems so we come to practical solutions. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about these vital things.
Thank you very much, Pam. You're all making a moderator's life very easy by saying such interesting things and also sticking to your allotted time. So I do appreciate that. And also what you said about do no harm also makes me think of other areas like international humanitarian law, which deals with victims of armed conflict. So there and has do no harm as a core principle. So there are many areas that we can draw on in considering these issues. I'd like to turn next to Eleni Hickok. Eleni, we know that one of the characteristics of our digital world is extreme complexity. And it seems to me that large, complex societies pose special problems with regard to digital ethics and digital services. And I'm wondering if you can enlighten us on what governance models can work best in enormously complex societies.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you, Pam, for that interesting opening and really grounding us in the importance of reality. And I think, building on that, I would say that when we look at complexity and complex questions of, even taking the example of Aadhaar, how do you provide identity for a population of 1.2 billion people who might not necessarily have had identity before that? You start to realize that the answers and the ways of doing this are complicated, and so are the relationships that exist and emerge out of them, relationships between government, private sector, and individuals, and these are shaped and formed by different platforms and mediums that are being used. For example, governments use platforms to deliver governance. Individuals also push for change at a local level and a global level through these platforms. Governments depend on the private sector to develop and manage solutions. Sometimes these private sector companies are domestic companies, and sometimes they're foreign companies. At the same time, we have companies making commitments, ethical commitments about not developing technologies that will harm individuals or undermine human rights, but they're exploring markets where governments have undermined human rights before. Governments are turning to the private sector to understand what are solutions for broken processes. Recently, the Cloud Act was enacted, where the private sector has the ability to answer a broader scope of data requests from governments, because the IMLAT system has been proven to no longer be effective. Governments are putting obligations on companies through legislation to moderate and take down and flag content. So where is the accountability in these measures? At the same time, I think governments are recognizing that there's a fundamental set of rights, data rights, that are needed to enable the right to privacy in a digital space. We see this in the GDPR. Many of these rights are reflected in India's draft data protection legislation. And at the same time, that draft data protection legislation has very broad data localization requirements. Then that asks questions about power and control of data. So I guess out of all of this, the question is, what should governance look like? What is it looking like? And I think a reality is that data-rich is an approach to governance. And to me, any technologically mediated governance structure will need to be designed to incorporate accountability, transparency, responsiveness, and inclusiveness to enable trust. It is also important that the responsibility of that structure is to drive empowerment, equity, and participation. As powers are shifted to different actors in different configurations, they need to be done so with associated responsibilities and duties, as well as accountability mechanisms. And last of all, just as we need an ecosystem approach to define the problem, we need an ecosystem approach to address the problem. There are a range of stakeholders, and they all play a role. There are a range of policy tools, and they all play a role. I think ethics gives us an opportunity to contextualize, to step back, to ask the question about human harm. Human rights allows us to center different developments and harmonize different developments with the individual and core rights to the individual at the center. So that said, I would say progress is incremental. It happens in baby steps, forward, backwards, sideways, and it's often negotiated. I don't think companies woke up after GDPR came into force and were immediately compliant. I guess to finish, I'd like to highlight the concept of resilience. Resilience can be understood as the ability to move forward, to recover, and to adapt to change. So if we are to build systems to be resilient, I think that we must look at the process not as failure, but as a negotiation going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those very interesting comments. I'm going to turn to Jules now with a question regarding technology and the role of technology. I have to say, as a law professor, I always get my hackles up a bit when people say, oh, the lawyers are the problem, and we have to solve everything through technology. I think a functioning legal system and the rule of law is the basis for everything before we can look to protecting privacy and ethics through other means. But I do have to admit that the legal system is overwhelmed and cannot do this by itself. We need to find other ways to implement digital ethics. So Jules, there's quite a great deal of hope being put in technological solutions as a way to improve data protection and implement digital ethics. But I'm wondering, in your view, will the future applications of technology really give people more control over their digital selves?
At the Future of Privacy Forum, we try to bring together civil society, academics, industry, advocates, ethicists, because at the end of the day, I think the path to moving forward is forcing those audiences to integrate. We talk sometimes about technology as if it's this different thing that's creating problems, but it is today the layer of how we live our lives in so many ways and is likely to be more so. And so certainly we need to look at the new problems that are specifically technical or that are specifically exacerbated by technology. But we also need to sit back a little bit and say, you know what, some of these are problems of humanity. Some of these are problems first being exposed because we can say the algorithm is biased, but actually it's reflecting the bias of humanity. And are we doing a better job or a worse job? That doesn't mean it's okay if it's doing a better job. We are, for the first time, however, looking at some of these ugly issues, and where ethics can play a role is leveraging the fact that it makes it interesting all of a sudden to look at some issues that are only the domains of people in various communities. Well, now it is all of our issue. And so we're having debates we should have solved where we don't have consensus many years ago, and we're doing it in the context of this new technology. So that's why some of this is so hard, because solving some of these problems are not simply technical fixes. We're looking at the deep challenges of the problems of humanity highlighted, maybe exacerbated, and we're forcing ourselves to confront that we hire in a biased way, in a face-to-face way. So the human in the loop, but maybe technology can help us expose the bias that has always been in the loop. Maybe it's getting worse, and now maybe technology and ethics can help us solve it. So here's why I'm optimistic. We've had a lot of pessimism, and there's clearly a lot to worry about. But I see a number of areas where there is technology on the move, technology hopefully motivated by law, by GDPR, by ethics. So let me tick off a number of the areas where I see optimism and hope for progress. First of all, browsers. You know what the technologists call web browsers? They call them user agents. And despite the complications and the advertising and the conflicts, many of the people who work on user agents do believe that they are agents of the user. Maybe we should rename them agents of the individual to give it a more ethical component. But we see them adding tools, better blocking, better controlling cookies, better dealing with advertising, cabining the user, and hopefully taking more responsibility, that notion of being the agent of the user. We see privacy-friendly browsers making it into the market with some greater energy for the first time, whether it's Brave or whether it's the features that you see in many others. We see privacy-friendly search kicked off in the years of the Snowden revelations, if you watch the metrics of how search is moving and how the privacy-focused search engines, the startups that are marketing themselves as more restrictive versions, are escalating. Still a very, very small percent, but you see them escalating when you look at their trajectory. Blockchain, everybody's interested. It doesn't matter what conference you're at. Blockchain will solve the problem. Well, I think we probably have some skepticism. You saw the Keneal's report, the Commerce Department NIST, focusing on how public blockchain, by definition, is challenged because of how it exposes personal information. But there may be opportunities for blockchain to support sovereign identity that is actually fully controlled by the individual instead of government or other parties. Will AI actually be a part of the solution? Well, we're seeing increasingly companies looking to do AI on the device at the endpoint in a way that doesn't pull back data. Certainly not available for many areas, but great progress. Just this week, there was a very important paper from some leading machine learning experts who look at the current state of AI and say, it's very narrow, it's very domain specific. If we want general intelligence, we might need to look to graph networks, not neural networks. Neural networks, we know, are dependent on vast amounts of information, sometimes needed to deal with bias, sometimes needed to deal with fairness, but creating, obviously, tensions as we push data minimization. Graph networks, some arguing now the next step for real broader intelligence, use more of a sampling model. So again, we see perhaps signs of progress. The market for privacy tools to comply with GDPR has taken an incredible demand. And the people at companies who perhaps always wanted these tools but didn't have the budget now are pointing to the law and to the fines and are finally getting the funding. And so we see investment coming. We have an office in Israel. It's amazing how many cybersecurity companies all of a sudden say, oh, privacy tools. And so you see machine learning to help companies find where their data is, better categorize it, better have controls. So I think there's real optimism there. You heard from Professor Norman Sadeh, and one of his most fascinating projects is machine learning tools for the user to be the AI that negotiates for the user in how to deal with the outside world. Very exciting. Privacy engineering finally becoming a significant discipline on every part of the world, where the technologists who are now being told, here's the law, are saying, wait a second, how does this work in standards at the ISO, at IEEE? I think incredibly important advance, and the IPEN group coordinated by the EDPS is such an important part of that. I'll have two final points that I think are first beginning as well. Our DPAs and their teams, many of them have gotten new staff. To the extent that technologists are being hired, so that the authorities aren't reading the media and then deciding where to investigate, but have the capacity on their own to make smart determinations, to understand the technology at the front. One of the most critical things. It'll make them stronger and more dangerous, and it'll make them smarter and more practical, and I think that is for the good of all of us. And final point, we always criticize self-regulation, and obviously we have law now, so we have a focus maybe away from self-regulation. But do we have more self-policing? At the end of the day, the authority should be the backstop. What are we doing, all of us who are interacting here, to make sure we have independent watchdogs? So we see journalists, Julie Angwin and others, who are getting funding to be watchdogs. But frankly, there's more that industry and others could do to set up independent technical watchdogs that can do some of this policing, so that we don't only read about it and say, how is this going on, but we catch and identify and maybe solve some of these issues in ahead. Thanks, Chris. Those are my thoughts.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Jules. And with perfect timing, the organizers have just handed me a tablet which contains a number of questions that all of you have been asking during the presentations. And as I look at them, I'm very, I can't wait to hear what our panelists will make of them. So let me direct, the first question is directed to Ellen and I. And the question is as follows: do you anticipate a move away from Eurocentric discussions of data protection and digital ethics, which I think is a very good question?
I think we need to move away in some ways. I mean, I think we need to take the best practices, perhaps. But I think any discussion, any law, any system needs to be reflective of that context. And I truly believe that happened in India. If you read that Sri Krishna report, they really engaged with what exists out there, what exists in the GDPR, and does this apply to India? And they pushed back on some things. They didn't incorporate rights such as the right to explainability because they felt that an accountability mechanism is the more appropriate one. And so I think that GDPR and Eurocentric concepts, pave an important path. They set certain precedents, but any initiative has to be contextualized, and I do believe that that is happening.
May I jump in on that?
Yes, please, Pam.
So if we want to put ethics into action, we must take smaller bites of the pie, and we must find ways to actively contextualize the existing rules. I agree with you completely about India. India produced a number of reports from groups of experts, and both reports took the ideas, global ideas on privacy, and contextualized them for India. Now, it's very important that this is also happening in Africa. There is a large delegation of African DPAs here at this conference, and I think it is vital that we engage with the global south and that we find ways of contextualizing privacy in different regions which have different values, technologies, procedures, and cultures. So I think it's absolutely vital to understand that Europe is Europe. These good ideas, we must have discussions, empower all stakeholders, and find practical ways of applying these things.
Thank you. And I would just add that, yes, the European model of data protection has been very successful and is very influential. However, all of us in Europe have to remember that historically the influence of European law around the world has not been solely benign. And we need to really globalize the discussion here, of course, taking inspiration from all of the different strands of thought around the world, of which Europe has a very important body to contribute. But I also think data protection is an area where there is a lot of cross-fertilization between different systems, and we need to continue that. So I do not promise that these questions are easy ones to answer, but I know that you're all such experts that these won't throw you. And I have to direct the next one to Wojciech. Wojciech, the question is to you, and it says, how far does, in your opinion, the U.S. Cloud Act pose a risk to European companies relying on U.S.-based cloud services? So as I said, not an easy question, but I want to ask for your thoughts on that.
Well, definitely it created a new environment for the discussion about the transfer of data, but first of all about the use of data by the American companies. Influential and setting the stand, but this is not anything that broke the normal discussion. So we are taking it into consideration. We've been a little bit shocked at the moment when it was created. I think most of the data protection authorities, and we started to ask what is the real impact of what's going on in Europe and what is the real enforcement of that when it goes to the American offices. I don't think we have at the moment the answers to these questions. And as you know, probably even better than me, the influence of the regulation on both sides of the Atlantic is limited somehow, and the agreements that we have with the United States are in this sense more important.
Okay. Thank you, and I agree. I think this is going to be an ongoing issue, and it's hard to give a clear answer now, but it's something that will obviously be continued to be discussed. The next question is directed to you, Jules, and again, it's not an easy question, but we're looking forward to hearing what you make of it because it's very interesting. So, Jules, yesterday, Jaron Lanier and other speakers said that they thought that advertising-based business models were purposely manipulative and thus unethical. Do you think a company that relies on an advertising business model can be an ethical steward of its customers' data simply by complying with the law?
No, I do think that you can act unethically in the way you try to persuade people and not be deceptive and illegal. And there may be advertising where we want that persuasion because we think it is for a good. Right? We want to persuade you to brush your teeth. And if advertisers help us take that message beyond what the teachers or our parents tell us, and they compete that this is, the best brand and so forth, and at the end of the day, we are brushing our teeth or we're doing other, morally valuable tools, certainly advertising can play a key role. Where advertising goes wrong is when the techniques are, immoral in their efforts, undermine our autonomy, or, of course, when they use data in ways that go beyond what we think is reasonable and a fair expectation. So I do think that by having understanding of what is moral with advertising, and I think one of the challenges is there are those who perhaps think advertising is immoral, and I would argue that is a loggerheads that ends the conversation, right? You can have a hard time talking to a company that maybe uses data or uses advertising and say, well, be moral, but by the way, your entire model is immoral. No room for progress. I think lots of room for progress when we say, of course there's a role, and here is how a moral society uses data, advertises, gains consent, balances interests. So I'm a little bit more of an optimist. I think Jaron has shown us that we've gone awry sometimes, and we're building his first book, I Am Not a Gadget, said, hey, we're treating people like they are the to be hacked as opposed to serve us. But I think what's wonderful about the internet at the end of the day is the pressures of billions of people and thoughtful people does drive change. Law does drive change. And so I do think we can have moral data use and moral advertising use.
May I offer a brief comment?
Please.
So I want to talk about a different aspect of advertising. So something I've researched for about 20 years is data brokers. And I have long experience in looking at what's happening with data broker issues. Now, in Europe, I do think that the GDPR has solved some of the data broker issues. I really do. But in the US and in huge swaths of Asia and other parts of the global south, there are no such rules. So I do think that if we, for example, are empowered to use our debit and our credit cards and various financial apps, fintech apps, are we going to be profiled because we are using this type of digital money and money that leaves a transactional trail? It is very common now that our retail purchases are used to determine all sorts of things about us, AI scores and other things like this. Are you a good consumer? Are you a good risk to be employed? If you're an employee, will you be promoted to a new position based on your transactional histories? We must take care of this problem. This is a problem. We should be able to have the freedom to purchase things and to live our lives freely without always looking over our shoulder at our digital trail that we've left. And I do think that of these digital trails, financial information, especially our purchase histories, and also health-related information is of crucial importance to work through what I call the new digital Nuremberg codes. We need to be empowered as individuals to have a robust discussion with the financial institutions, with healthcare institutions, and say, hey, look, and also the data brokers and people selling and sharing this data, and say, look, there needs to be some guidelines here. How does this work? How are all of the stakeholders going to manage and work with these very, very rapid-moving data flows?
So I think maybe
Please.
Building on that and the point that you made about some contexts not having the same amount of robust legislation, I think this drives to a larger point that companies cannot necessarily place the same business model across the globe evenly. I think the ethical question there for a company is, do they decide to take advantage of the fact that a context does not have a legislation and it might be easier for them to collect, operate, whatever, data, or do they take a decision and say, okay, they don't have a legislation, but we're still going to adhere to XYZ procedures, follows standards, etc.
It's a really great point.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to all of you who responded to that question. We have another question now, which is directed to Pam. Is it possible to list the fundamental principles of digital ethics, not only from the data controller or data processor point of view, but also from the user point of view?
Right, that's a wonderful question. Thank you to whoever asked that. I really appreciate it. So the first thing is, yes, whoever asked that question, the users are a very crucial part of this process. And if users have not been empowered to come to the table and to create in a co-equal fashion the ethical principles, then I would submit that these principles are not valid. We cannot have ethical principles that are created only by governments, or ethical principles that are created only by industry or institutions, or even only by users. There must be all considerations at the table. This is never easy, but this is what you find behind the most long-lasting, important things. It's based in reality. To go back to the question, though, how do we empower users to have a stake at this? This is what has to change the most. This is a very practical question. So when I first began working in privacy, which was in the late 90s, I had this vision of this massive silver bullet. If we could just somehow find this big giant bullet, we could launch it and fire it at a big elephant, and the elephant would die, and we would have solved all the harms and all the problems in privacy. And reality has taught me that, you know what, privacy is a complex problem. It's multifactorial, and it requires privacy data is a lot like water. It's like a river. The stream is moving in a very complex ecosystem. You can put your foot into it, take it out, and 5 minutes later, when you put your foot into it again, it's already changed. The only way we can deal with this rapidly changing environment is to bring people together, and users must be empowered to have a say and to say what it is that frightens them, what harms they are experiencing. The companies must listen. The governments must listen. There must be an equal dialogue. I hope that's responsive to the question.
Chris, let me just add.
Yes.
I think we know what ethics are. We've got human rights at the UN level. We've got them in the Charter. We've got philosophers for years teaching and talking. We know what ethics are. What we haven't done a good job of, when it comes to technology at least, is how to do those balances, because it's never fully black and white. It's never, this is advertising, it's always bad. This is security, it's always bad, right? What we are challenged of is when we see one value, provide security, provide products, provide the service, don't hire, dangerous criminals to do, important financial jobs, right? And then when we misalign, right? And this is what the lesson of the Nuremberg trials are. There was all sorts of legal support for this. This was done through courts, right? This wasn't done by dictatorship. That's what was so offensive, is what happens when you see that society can run its system and come out with horribly unethical tools. And so what we need to do, I think, is we've got those ethics, but how do we actually make the hard decisions and operationalize those balances? Yes, I would like you to sign up for my product. That doesn't mean I get to push you through without you, seeing the risks or offering it to the wrong people. It's at that level of detail. So it's the application of ethics. If I put a philosopher in the room with the coder, they wouldn't have a good conversation. It's the combination of all of us saying, okay, these are the 7 things, and we recognize these values, and here's how we weigh them, and this is where the societal differences come in, because there will be some different weights in certain societies of wanting to share more for research, wanting to share less for research. So, a thought.
Can I add on to Jules? Thank you, Jules. And I think that, something I should have said, and I'm really grateful for what you reminded me to say it. In terms of a list, that's what I meant by the giant silver bullet. We have to contextualize in smaller pieces what we're trying to do. If it gets to be too big of a list that applies across all domains, I think we lose relevance. I think that there are very large codes. For me, the most central code is what we are doing with data must provide a public good, and it must also do no harm. For me, this is the guiding ethos. We must find multiple ways of contextualizing this, making it specific across domains, which will require different conversations, smaller conversations, and it's governance. It's how do you make this into day-to-day governance is going to be imbued by those conversations across domains. And ethics lives in the specifics. There's general, long-lasting generalities, but then the day-to-day has to live in the specifics.
Can I add something, because that was a part of the discussion in the Creative Cafe as well. Jules have said that we know what is ethics, but of course the first discussion that started there was, do we really know? And is the ethics that we teach to the people, is the ethics that we teach to our children something which is really universal? And the other question which started to arise is that each of the young person of age of probably 16, 18 was raised in some kind of ethics. But the critical thinking starts with questioning the ethics that you were born and raised in. So does it mean that questioning the ethics and the critical thinking is not ethical itself? So it starts to be the discussion over discussion which have to create this environment.
And I would add that I think it's important to look at ethics and human rights as complementing. Human rights are standards, they're established, it's a framework, they're norms that we can turn to, we can point to, and there's a level of agreement and accountability against them. While ethics allows for that, as Jules was saying, that nuanced decision making. So I would just say that when we talk about ethics, to me it's also very important to talk about human rights.
Well, I see this question has really struck a chord in all of the panelists, as it should, because it was an excellent question.
Yes,
Thank
very
you
good.
all for your contributions. We're coming close to the end of the panel. We have just one more question, which is to the entire panel. And I feel fairly certain this was a question that was asked by a data protection officer, perhaps for a company or a public administration. The question is, should there be codes of ethics for data protection officers in addition to the laws? What do you think?
I think the most powerful thing we could do at the end of the day is empower the people whose job is to think about data protection and ethics to not simply be thoughtful advisors, but to actually have obligations to live up to codes, to have their roles be reflected in broader standards that are beyond individual companies. So anything that we can do, whether it's code, whether it's for this sector, this is the right balancing text. I mean, the most powerful parts of the GDPR are when companies are forced to show their work internally and go through that process. And to the extent that those are documents and there are obligations of the people who are in that sector, we are operationalizing ethics in an effective way. So I think so.
I would ask, what does it mean, the code of ethics that we had a question about? Because if it's, do we need the guidelines for the DPOs, how to deal with it? Or do we need the real code of conduct, which also includes enforcement? Meaning you cannot be the DPO if you break it.
So I'm intrigued by the question. I really like this question. And so to me, you know what I would love to see? Here's what I would love to see. I would love to see each DPA come together with their staff in their jurisdiction, dealing with the problems that they're dealing, have a conversation with themselves and their stakeholders, the companies they're dealing with, the institutions they're dealing with, and their stakeholders in their jurisdiction, and arrive at something that's meaningful to them. What are the problems they face? What are they afraid of? What are the bad things that are happening? What are the mitigations that will resolve those things? And then it would be wonderful to have all of the DPAs compare notes, because I suspect that these notes would be different based on the context of the jurisdiction and just where the problems are in each jurisdiction. And I think this would be very fruitful because these are our best thinkers on privacy and human rights and civil liberties. So it would be a wonderful thing to see the results. And this actually may be something that could be considered for next year.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for your contributions. We're now almost exactly at the end of our time. And I want to use now these last few seconds to give the results to the survey we took of those of you in the room. Admittedly unscientific, but still we have such a diverse group here. I think it has some value. Again, the question we asked was, are you in favor of a treaty or agreement on digital ethics at the level of the United Nations or some other international organization? And the answer, or the response of the room, 76% said yes, 24% no. So we have a clear consensus, I think, in favor of some sort of treaty or agreement. But now, of course, we need to see what the international organizations will do for this call. Anyway, I want to thank everyone for your attention. We've now reached the end of our time for this session. I think I'm supposed now to turn the floor over again to Paminder, who's been such a wonderful person, doing such a great job as being sort of the moderator of this whole conference.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you all. That was a great discussion.